Last year, I spent several thousand words trying to understand Elden Ring's relationship to its map. I worried that, by including a map, especially one that seemed so much more useful than the game's sightlines, From Software would undercut the signature sense of mystery that they'd cultivated across their previous titles. I was particularly afraid that it would turn the game into a giant checklist. Well, about that. Maps, while famously not the territory, shape our experience of it. This is as true in video games as in the physical world, and in the modern day, maps of both are becoming increasingly homogenized. Much like how AAA video games have increasingly incorporated standardized map features, there's little incentive to collect data and design your own map when you can just visualize data that Google has already collected for you in a design language that already fills our days. Historically, though, maps in games have taken radically different forms to fulfill radically different functions. Forms and functions that are distinct from those of real-world maps. And unlike in physical space, the relationship between a video game's map and the territory it supposedly represents is messier. Take the classic JRPG world map, for example. This is a map of Final Fantasy VI, and this is the overworld map in Final Fantasy VI. The former is a map of the latter, and the latter is, well, weird. There's no real physical space to reference, and only some parts of the map are abstractions of a different in-game space. A town on the world map represents a separate set of streets and buildings, but a forest doesn't represent an area that the player can go to in the same way. It only exists as an abstraction of a fictional idea. Most importantly, this map is where a lot of the game happens. You move across the map, and the characters move across the world that the map represents. In the game's fiction, this is a map, but from the player's perspective, it's the territory. And from the computer's perspective, well, that's where things get really weird, especially in 3D space. Let me show you what I mean. This is the in-game map of The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time. The game starts here in Kakariko Village and ends here at the top of Ganon's castle. For the vast majority of playthroughs, this is the world in which Ocarina of Time takes place. Simple, normal, physically contiguous. All things that most of us aspire to be. But then, this is a map of an Ocarina of Time speedrun, collaged together from thousands of screenshots of in-game locations, all hosted on vgmaps.com, which is an extremely cool website, by the way. Check it out. Obviously, something very fucked up has happened here, as Ganon's castle is now inside the Great Deku Tree. How this happens is irrelevant. The important part is that players aren't teleporting across the world to arrive at Ganon's castle. They're moving the castle itself inside the Great Deku Tree. And from the game's perspective, this is totally fine, because the only area that really matters is the one you're in right now. So both of these are maps of Ocarina of Time, it's just that the world is intended by developers and the world is experienced by speedrunners are two different things, which require two different maps. Players, through their knowledge of the game's database, reshape the territory itself, and the maps followed. For most of the Souls games, FromSoft didn't include an in-game map at all, so the only ones that exist are fan-made resources geared for specific play experiences. Before Elden Ring, only Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, the series' cool second cousin, even had an in-game map at all. It's called the Antique Map, and it looks like this. Okay, I didn't say it was a particularly useful map for actually navigating Sekiro, but it is a map. It might not express the exact geographic relationships between these spaces, but it does help illustrate the intersection of geography and social hierarchy in the world of the game. It's like this map of Disney World cited in Abhishek Nagaraj and Scott Stern's paper, The Economics of Maps. They write, "Maps produced by Disney are given out for free, but are meant to stimulate demand for Disney-owned properties and attractions. The commercial goals of the sponsoring organization, therefore, have an important role to play in shaping the nature of maps." The question then is, who is the sponsoring organization behind Sekiro's map? And what did they hope to represent? The most obvious answer, given how heavily the game's story focuses on imperial hierarchy, is the state. This map, then, represents how those with power in this world believe that these spaces interact, or should interact, with one another. Mibu Village isn't just topographically lower than Fountainhead Palace or Ashina Castle, it's also at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So, what about Elden Ring? What does its in-game map hope to represent? Well, let me describe the closest thing that Elden Ring has to a universal feeling. Early in the game's first area, Limgrave, there is a forest called Mistwood. In it, you find an abandoned village and great runic bears and a noble, soon-to-be-broken man. But that's not what people remember about this place. On the map, the only break in Mistwood's tree line is a small, circular clearing around a short, quiet building. And in that building is an elevator. When you step onto it, intricate patterns on the platform light up in a color you know means magic. It takes you down for a long time. The architecture of the narrow shaft widens into a tower-like structure, gives way to rough-hewn stone, and then to architecture again. Then, a gap in the wall opens onto an enormous cavern, and you see the stars for the first time. And then you realize that you're seeing the stars for the first time. Their absence from Elden Ring's blinding night sky made suddenly profound by their presence beneath the earth. And so, you check your map expecting some trick of geography to save you, to reassure you that, just as it has half a dozen times before, the game has taken you, magically, to a different place. But no, you're still in Limgrave, or, more accurately, beneath it. Your map has 2 layers, and it is staggering. The Shifa River Valley is an inversion of Dark Souls 2's Big Trick, where you go up an elevator and find yourself in a lava castle. But where that game uses this moment to invoke a sense of wrongness, of dream logic, Elden Ring rejects this easy out. Instead, it declares, assertively, this is how the world, according to some, is designed to work. And this is explicit in the game's fiction, too. This dying world is built on the bones of one already dead, another empire whose gods were ripped from the sky and made in facsimile underground. The Underworld map is a signifier that this isn't some small, ancillary area, but rather an entire world to explore. The map becomes a signifier that there is territory to be known, territory to be conquered. The YouTuber Writing on Games describes the feeling of exploring and, his word here, conquering the map as the true joy at the heart of Elden Ring's design. Domination is the fantasy at the heart of all the Souls games, but previous entries focused on the conquering of specific foes, not space. The map becomes the frame through which we can understand Elden Ring. The Souls games have always had difficulty that can be modified by systemic knowledge. In fact, it's a big part of what let them keep their reputation as extremely difficult games for as long as they did. As Noah Caldwell-Gervais discusses in his video, I Beat the Dark Souls Trilogy and All I Made Was This Lousy Video essay, this variable difficulty results from the truly astounding number of tools a player can use in any given encounter. The difficulty is designed to be modulated by knowledge of the game world. This means that, at least initially, the games are reserved for people who can devote massive amounts of time to mapping them, or those with exceptional reflexes and a taste for pain. The series only becomes approachable through communal mapmaking. And this, it appears, is the game's working as intended. The summoning system in the original Dark Souls was all but defined by how hard it was to play with your friends. Instead, you collaborated with total strangers for fleeting moments, during which they could distract bosses, giving you an opportunity to deal damage, but also model good play practices and tactics, or show you the path to a hidden item. The best co-op partners were good teachers, not combatants. Wiki mapmaking could even be considered a natural extension of the game's message system, which also facilitates asynchronous, anonymous collaboration and play, as well as, in classic FromSoft fashion, a healthy bit of trolling. We've looked at Sekiro's in-game map, but it has a fan-made one too, and people actually use it. It looks like this, and it's basically a flowchart. It won't show you the exact path you should take to get from one area to another, but it does show you how the areas relate to one another. It also, and this is important, tells you what items exist in which area. It is explicitly not a map of Sekiro's world, but of the game itself, as experienced by an idealized, perfectly thorough player, made for the benefit of other players. Sekiro, like other Souls games, never asks you to map it, never demands that you experience everything or know it completely. But its often obtuse objectives and demanding fights do pressure you as a player, asking you to improve your execution and increase your knowledge. It asks you to engage with it, to know it. And knowing takes time. So, if you don't have the time, well, at least you have this map. Like Sekiro, Elden Ring is another Souls game with two different maps. The first is the in-game map, actually useful this time, and the second is any one of a handful of interactive maps spread across websites like IGN, Life, and MapGenie, depending on your preference. All of these interactive maps are significantly more usable than the fan-made maps of Sekiro. This is primarily due to the presence of an in-game map upon which the interactive maps can be based, but also because these maps go way, way beyond the realm of fan labor. Life and IGN aren't just wiki hosts, they're also active media publications that devote resources to maintaining their wikis and producing guides, including the web development costs of producing an interactive map. And these changes to the economic conditions of creating these maps and guides have absolutely changed the maps themselves. As Nagaraj and Stern write, not only is the map not the territory, but it is also a potentially biased representation shaped by social, political, and economic forces. The choices of data and design that underlie the making of a map are shaped by economic forces. And I cannot think of many better examples of this fact than Etrian Odyssey. Originally released for the Nintendo DS and 3DS, Etrian Odyssey is a series about maps. In it, you run a small mercenary company tasked by the state with exploring massive and dangerous dungeons. You explore these dungeons from a first-person perspective on a massive grid mapped by hand. And thanks to the staggering power of the Nintendo DS, that grid-based map-making has never been easier. But thanks to the game's design, that map-making has rarely been so necessary. Etrian Odyssey's dungeons are big, labyrinthine, filled with traps, rest spots, and hidden pathways, all of which you can, but don't have to, map by hand. When appraising your maps, whether via survey leaders or a random guard blocking your progress, the game only asks that your maps are mostly accurate to the physical layout of the dungeon you've explored. You don't need to mark things like gathering points or camping spots if you don't feel like it. If the walls are there, from the game's perspective, you're good. In some Etrian Odyssey games, though, the more accurate your map is, the better you're paid, and being paid is very important in Etrian Odyssey. Let me tell you a story. When I started Etrian Odyssey 3, I made a party of real shit kickers. I marched them into the dungeon, and, they did okay. They killed a few monsters, took their parts, and when they were a bit hurt, I started on my way back. Then, a random encounter broke bad and killed my primary damage dealer. This is fine, I thought. I'll just keep marching back to town, sell some monster parts, and then rest at the inn to bring her back. Sadly, I severely underestimated the financial strain of necromancy. Inns in Etrian Odyssey usually provide two basic services, with prices that scale based on your level. Resting, which allows your characters to regain HP and MP, and Resurrection, which allows you to bring dead characters back to life. Turns out, Resurrection is expensive, very expensive in fact. Resting your entire party costs 5N per level of your strongest character. If you have a level 10 party member, resting costs 50N. Reviving follows this exact same formula, but for a single character. If you then have to heal your party on top of that, you've effectively doubled your healing cost. All of this is complicated by the fact that the average early game dungeon run brings in about 30N, maybe 50 on a good day. And in case you were wondering, no, you can't just use healing magic to prevent your characters from dying, because that uses MP, which in the early game can only be recovered by spending way more money than you would just saving your MP and resting at the end. So I would, for the first time in my life, actually have to invest in non-combat skills. I hired a bunch of new characters, including a farmer who specialized in gathering, and marched them back into the dungeon. It was very effective. So effective, in fact, that I managed to free myself from medical debt and bring my original party back to life. Hooray! Pockets full of precious N, I went to the store to actually buy new gear for the first time and realized that all that stuff was really expensive too. I would always have to stop by gathering points to afford basic upgrades, let alone unique weapons. To continue progressing, I would need to improve my map. It's a brilliant piece of design and a perfect illustration of Nagaraj and Stern's argument that maps are shaped by external economic forces. Extra Life, Map Genie, and IGN's interactive versions of Elden Ring's map track and checklist bosses, quest givers, and thousands of item locations, all of which are built on top of the in-game map, all resulting from non-commercial fan contributions and the work of full-time wiki editors and guides writers. A big reason for this level of detail is that as games have grown in both scope and density, guides writers have become increasingly important to their rollout and marketing. By the end of my time reviewing games for Vice, we started receiving review press kits that included SEO-friendly headline suggestions for guides writers. These guides and players' dependence on them are an expected part of the media storm around a given game's release. This is particularly true of massive live service games, which some people play exclusively with what limited free time they have outside of work and familial obligations. They don't have time to solve puzzles or explore a massive world, and rely on guides writers to do that work for them. Economic factors don't just put pressure on map makers, but also on those of us who consume the knowledge goods they create. This is, in part, why criticism by way of product description has become standard practice in games media. Games designed around extraction don't just affect how we play them, but also how we talk about them, whether by choice or by necessity. And Elden Ring's map has become inseparable from that media apparatus. Unlike previous Souls games which either had no map at all, or in Sekiro's case, a map that wasn't even trying to be useful, commercially or otherwise, Elden Ring had an in-game map around which the guides economy could orient itself. And to be clear, I don't think that FromSoft made their games obtuse so a cottage industry of guides writers and virtual cartographers would emerge. But I do think that their game design facilitates this type of economic activity. The Extra Life, Map Genie, and IGN maps have become the centerpieces of their respective wikis, the resource from which all others can be found. The player experiences Elden Ring as a territory mediated by the game's map, and the wikis mirror this structure, treating the wiki itself as a territory of its own. By exploring the interactive map, players can discover linked individual item pages and area walkthroughs. It becomes a representation of both Elden Ring's world and the wiki itself. None of these maps are the territory, but they do become the frame through which we experience it. And here we get to the worry I mentioned at the start of this video, because like with real-world maps, there's a problem. By their nature, maps have a high fixed cost of initial development and a lower marginal cost of replication, write Nagaraj and Stern. The production of a map encourages entry by imitative map makers, which reduces the incentive to produce original maps. As the guides economy has grown, the average quality of guides has begun to rapidly decline. Not because the writers are worse, but because guides and aggregation-heavy news coverage are particularly susceptible to plagiarism, whether by large language models or human hacks. Right now, the goal of commercial game development is less to create a world that feels alive, and more to create a database that is itself compelling. This is the natural result of an SEO-driven media economy, and it's only going to get worse until significant changes are made to Google's PageRank algorithm. Even then, those changes will likely encourage their own new and frustrating shifts in media and communal knowledge practices. But there is another way, too. To fight the boss of the Shifa River Valley, the ancestral spirit, you must first light 8 sconces scattered across the area, each guarded by a handful of enemies called ancestral followers. In most areas of Elden Ring, you could just kill the spirits, light the sconces, and repeat. However, enemy placements in the Shifa River Valley are uniquely challenging. A half-dozen snipers dot the map watching the sconces and each other's positions. It's an extended combat puzzle framed as an act of ritual magic. The only way to avoid getting shot in the back while fighting spirits and lighting sconces is to sneak through the areas, only taking on enemies where the snipers can't see you. And the interactive maps of IGN and Extra Life cannot help you here. They don't include enemy placements, and even if they could, their positions on a 2D map wouldn't express the verticality involved. Fallen structures flat on the map jut and rise from their broken bases, casting long shadows and breaking sightlines. This is why the place looms so large in my mind, why it feels so different from the rest of Elden Ring. You can only learn how to move through the Shifa River Valley by doing it. You need the perspective of the player character to properly calculate the trajectory of a sniper's arrow. You can map the sconces, sure, but the experience is, itself, unmappable. Lighting these fires requires an intimate understanding of the valley, one that the game teaches you through a long and violent series of conversations. The area is difficult, but that difficulty says something. The Golden Order that rules the lands between never really had control over the Shifa River Valley. You find your map of it on the corpse of one of their nobles, so clearly it didn't help them survive here either. Arriving at the Shifa River rewards you with one way of knowing, and then the territory itself teaches you another, one it considers a valid form of resistance. It is a different, more intimate form of knowing. It demands that you engage not with the database or with the map that represents it, but with the territory, the text, the thing itself. Or at least it used to. Games are notoriously difficult to preserve. The thing itself is always changing. What I just described was the version of the Shifa River Valley that I played in pre-release, and that wasn't just a different experience because the community had yet to exhaustively map it. At some point in the months following the game's release, the Shifa River Valley got patched. The enemies don't have less health or deal less damage, but they are significantly less defensive of their territory. The snipers don't fire their powerful magic arrows very much, and you don't really have to sneak through the valley anymore. You don't have to bother with the thing itself, don't have to learn its rhythms. These changes make the Shifa River Valley easier to explore and to extract content from, but harder to actually understand as a text. The enemy's ability to use the environment to their advantage made it necessary for players to learn those same skills. The way the ancestral followers fought was important to the story at the heart of the valley. Without it, the whole vibe of the area kind of falls apart. One of the biggest problems with the digital media culture obsessed with mapping and extraction is that it struggles to look backwards. It takes and then moves on to the next unmapped territory or text, uninterested in how its mapping practices have reshaped the thing itself. I can't tell you whether the public response to Elden Ring and to the Shifa River Valley's difficulty in particular was what led FromSoft to patch it, just like I can't say why other patches fixed arcane scaling or added NPC markers to the map. What I can tell you is that these decisions have affected the experience of playing Elden Ring, as well as the practices of its map makers and content creators. The true mark of success for the modern AAA video game is not to simply produce a product, but to create an entire industry of content creators and guides writers. It is to become mappable, with the knowledge that everything mappable under capitalism, like imperialism, will become a site of extraction, whether for content or for more traditional resources. And in that, I can't help but think of Jorge Luis Borges' story on exactitude in science. The whole thing is just 4 sentences long. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless. And not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there are no other relics of the disciplines of geography. You see, there are 2 tragedies in Borges' stories, albeit ironic ones. The first is of the empire's people and their wasted labor. Their leaders demanded a perfect cartography, and they achieved it, never realizing, as their descendants later would, that their vast map was, in fact, useless. More than useless even, this obsession was destructive. Imagine it for a moment, a map that coincided point for point with the world. It would require the participation of every citizen of the empire. It would become the center of their lives, a never-ending task pursued to the detriment of all else. They tried to replace the territory with its map, not just an impossible pursuit, but a ruinous one. The second tragedy is that of the story itself, framed as a small part of a much larger cultural work. You can see the edges of it in the syntax, in its invocation of and allusion to dozens of proper nouns that imply a greater epistemology. That empire, the deserts of the West, the inclemencies of sun and winters, this is a lost or imagined way of knowing the world. And that loss is worth mourning, worth elegizing. But even incomplete, even out of context, there is beauty and meaning here, because we have the story and not the map. This fragment alone communicates more than the vast empire's useless maps ever could. As my friend Jason Helms pointed out to me while discussing this video, all maps will eventually describe places that we can no longer visit. The difference with video games is that our maps change and, more importantly, decay at roughly the same rate as the territory. And those maps are already beginning to erode. The digital media business is burning. Over half a dozen publications have shuttered in the past year, including not one, but two that I used to work for. And large language models, influencer culture, and cruel, childish executives are at risk of choking out what little is left. Vice, the company that laid me off, is in the middle of bankruptcy proceedings. If the company goes all the way under, the work I did there might vanish. In just a few months, my original review of Elden Ring, where I first interrogated both the Shifa River Valley and Elden Ring's map itself, could be gone. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with the fact that the river has changed either. What I do know is that if I hadn't been making this video, I would have had no idea what was lost from the Shifa River Valley in the time since Elden Ring's release. That the meaning I found there is just gone now. And there is something to learn from that. As Jacob Geller notes in his video, The Future of Writing About Video Games, our conversations with the games we love should begin, not end, when the credits roll. That's the only way to really remember Elden Ring. I think to really understand what it was, we have to keep returning to it. It's possible that there will come a day when the servers shut down and the discs are all destroyed, and all of Elden Ring is effectively lost. But the maps will remain, at least in tatters. Hundreds of thousands of hours consolidated into privately owned wikis, YouTube channels, and media outlets. In that sea of content all describing what Elden Ring was, all I hope is that some fragment of it cares, even a little, about how it felt. What it meant. Hi, I'm gonna start with a short version of this. I'm Renata. Thank you so much for watching, it means a ton. You can support me by going to patreon.com/renorraven. Thank you to my brilliant and beautiful script editor Tessa and my video editor Isaac Holland, and special thanks to Jason Helms, Diego Arguello, Matthew Galt, and Miriam Strom for letting me bounce ideas and prose off of them for weeks. They are so very strong. Now, onto the longer version. I have spent 4 years in games media at as many different websites, Fanbyte, then Kotaku, then Waypoint, and then Remap. And in that time, I have had a pretty complicated relationship to the work itself, as you may expect from having 4 employers, 2 of which were gutted in as many years. I love criticism. I could and do think about it all day. But for structural reasons that I feel are pretty clearly laid out in this video, most of my time in games media wasn't actually spent doing the kind of work that really excites me. Work like this. This video was very hard and weird to make, and I hope it is, by a country mile, the worst video that I ever do. And to make that possible, I'd like to be able to continue doing this. So I would really appreciate it if you could support me at patreon.com/renorraven. The ad-based model is dying, and while rupture is not inherently liberatory, it is an opportunity to build something. So, let's get to work.